It was an ordinary day in May when police officers approached the abandoned bank building in Snowtown, South Australia, a remote, unassuming town with a population of fewer than 500 people. The building had long been empty, its bank vault unused for years. But when officers pried open the heavy, rusting vault door, they were immediately hit by a wave of stench so overpowering that one officer had to step outside to catch his breath. It was the unmistakable, putrid scent of rotting flesh. Inside the vault, against the cold concrete walls, they saw them barrels lined up in eerie silence. At first glance, they looked ordinary, but as detectives got closer, they noticed something else: the thick, syrupy liquid oozing from the lids. One officer hesitated before removing the top of a barrel. What he saw inside would haunt him forever: human remains, floating in acid, their features barely distinguishable. The body had been dissolving for weeks, if not months, but there was no mistaking what they were looking at. Then they opened another, and another. By the time they had counted, there were 8 bodies inside 6 barrels. Some victims had been dismembered, their limbs severed, their torsos crushed to fit inside. The liquid inside was a grotesque cocktail of decomposed flesh, acid, and decay. The scene was straight out of a horror film, but this was no fiction. Someone had been storing their victims here, preserving their remains in acid as if they were collecting trophies. And in that moment, one thing became clear. They had just uncovered the work of a serial killer unlike any Australia had ever seen. Long before his name became synonymous with horror, John Bunting was just another man living in the suburbs of Adelaide. To those who knew him casually, he was charming, even friendly, someone who cracked jokes, offered to help neighbors, and always seemed to be in control. But behind closed doors, John Bunting was a predator in disguise. He was born into a troubled home in Queensland, where he was subjected to abuse as a child. That trauma twisted into something far darker as he grew older. By his teenage years, he developed a deep, irrational hatred for certain groups of people, including those he considered weak, vulnerable, or different from him. But it didn't stop at hatred. He became obsessed with pain and power, starting with torturing small animals. But soon, that wasn't enough. He wanted to inflict suffering on people. He landed a job at an abattoir slaughterhouse as a teenager, and instead of being disturbed by the violence, he thrived in it. Colleagues noticed something unsettling. He took pleasure in the killing. The sight of blood, the smell of death, the sound of animals suffering, he enjoyed every second of it. By the time he reached adulthood, his sadistic urges had evolved into something far worse. Bunting started gathering a group of like-minded men, people he could manipulate, control, and use for his own twisted purposes. He hand-picked followers who shared his hatred, who wouldn't question his actions, who would help him do the unthinkable. And that's exactly what happened. Together, they created a secret world of torture, deception, and murder, targeting people they deemed unworthy of life. But what was truly chilling about John Bunting wasn't just the way he killed. It was how he made people trust him before turning on them. Some of his victims were even his own friends. John Bunting wasn't just a killer, he was a leader, a manipulator, a man who knew exactly how to control people, twist their minds, and turn them into his personal weapons. It started with words. Bunting would sit in his living room, beer in hand, and rant for hours about the people he hated. He had a long list of enemies, people he labeled as weak, disgusting, or unworthy of life. At first, it was just talk. Then he started recruiting. One by one, he pulled in men who shared his rage. Robert Wagner, Mark Hayden, James Vlasakis, these weren't hardened criminals. They were ordinary men who had no idea they were stepping into a nightmare. Bunting played the role of a vigilante, a man on a mission. He convinced them that they weren't just killing, they were cleansing society. The first few times he tested them, seeing how far they would go. Some hesitated, but no one left. No one was allowed to leave. This wasn't just a group of killers, it was a cult, and John Bunting was their god. He created a sick, twisted game where victims were chosen, tortured, and ultimately discarded like pieces of trash. Some were strangers, some were friends, some were even family. But in the beginning, no one suspected a thing, not even when the first body turned up. The year was 1992. Clinton Trezise was young, quiet, and struggling. He had a tough life, moving from place to place, trying to find stability. One day, he made the mistake of trusting John Bunting. Clinton knew Bunting casually. Maybe he thought he was making a new friend. Maybe he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the second he stepped into Bunting's house, his fate was sealed. No one knows exactly what set Bunting off that day, but once he decided Clinton was a target, there was no going back. Inside the house, Clinton was ambushed. The attack was brutal. He was beaten, his body left broken, his blood staining the floor. But the worst part, Bunting wasn't alone. He had an audience. This was a test run, a chance for his recruits to watch, learn, and get comfortable with murder. When it was over, Clinton was just another body to dispose of. Bunting and his gang wrapped his corpse in plastic and dumped it in a shallow grave in Lower Light, South Australia. They didn't panic. They didn't worry about getting caught. Because in their minds, this was just the beginning. For years, no one connected Clinton's disappearance to Bunting. He was just another missing person, a case that faded into the background. Until one day, his remains were found, buried, forgotten. Nothing but a skeleton in the dirt. And yet, even when his bones were uncovered, no one knew they belonged to the first victim of Australia's most sadistic serial killer. No one realized the monster had already started his hunt. When police finally stepped inside John Bunting's home, they weren't just looking at a crime scene. They were stepping into a serial killer's mind. The house was filthy, chaotic, and filled with a darkness that couldn't be ignored. But there was one room that stood out, the room where Bunting planned everything. On one wall, scribbled in messy, erratic handwriting, was a long list of names, a kill list. This was his personal death ledger. Some of the names had been crossed out, a chilling sign that those people were already dead. Others remained untouched targets waiting for their turn. These weren't just random names. Many of them were people Bunting personally knew, neighbors, old acquaintances, and even so-called friends. Some had even been inside this very house, drinking tea with the man who would later kill them. The ones still alive had no idea they were walking around with a death sentence written on Bunting's wall. But that wasn't the only horrifying discovery inside his home. There were boxes filled with disturbing trophies, personal belongings stolen from the victims after they were murdered. Some items were small, a ring, a wallet, a photograph. Others were worse. In one chilling instance, police found a jar with a pair of human teeth inside. But perhaps the most disturbing part of Bunting's house wasn't what was written on the walls or what was inside those boxes. It was the smell. A putrid, sickening stench that clung to the air, seeping from the floorboards, the walls, the furniture. Because Bunting didn't always dispose of his victims right away. Some rotted inside the house before they were eventually moved. And yet, for years, no one suspected a thing. Because John Bunting was a master of deception. He didn't just kill his victims, he made them trust him first. John Bunting's methods weren't just brutal, they were calculated. He didn't hunt strangers in the dark. He didn't stalk victims from the shadows. He invited them in. Most of the people Bunting killed never saw it coming because to them he wasn't a threat. He was a friend, a mentor, a protector. He would seek out the vulnerable people down on their luck, struggling with addiction or isolated from their families. Then he would offer them help. Come stay at my place. I can lend you some money. Don't worry, you can trust me. And they did. One by one, they walked into his house, believing they were safe. But they weren't. Once inside, Bunting would start playing his sick game. He had a talent for turning his victims into prisoners before they even realized it. Sometimes he convinced them to stay longer. Sometimes he took their phones, their IDs, their money until they had nowhere else to go. And by the time they realized something was wrong, it was already too late. For some, death was quick. For others, it was slow, agonizing. But for all of them, it started the same way. With a smile, a handshake, a lie. And the moment they stepped through Bunting's door, they were already dead. For most killers, murder is the final act, the climax of their twisted desires. But for John Bunting, death was just the end of the performance. The real thrill came before. His victims didn't just die, they suffered. Bunting had a ritual, a method to his madness that turned every murder into a prolonged, agonizing event. It wasn't about just killing, it was about complete domination. Some victims were restrained for hours, sometimes days before the final blow. During that time, Bunting and his gang would take turns inflicting pain, both physical and psychological. Burns, beatings, cigarette stubs pressed into flesh, broken bones, teeth pulled out, mockery, laughter, taunts. He forced his victims to beg for their lives, scream and cry, relishing every second of their torment. And then the final act. Bunting would coerce them into recording messages to their families, pretending they were still alive. The victims, their voices barely above a whisper from exhaustion and terror, would mutter rehearsed lines. Hey, I'm fine. Just went away for a bit. Don't worry about me. A desperate attempt to save themselves. But it was never enough. Once Bunting had wrung every last drop of suffering from them, he delivered the final blow. Some were strangled with ropes or hands, their last breaths choked out slowly. Others were beaten to death, their skulls caving in under the relentless force. And a few suffered an even worse fate, dismemberment, while still alive. For Bunting, murder wasn't just about erasing someone. It was about erasing their dignity, their identity, their very humanity. And in his mind, their deaths weren't the end of their usefulness. Even after their bodies stopped breathing, Bunting still had plans for them. John Bunting was more than just a serial killer. He was a puppeteer. And even after his victims were dead, he kept pulling the strings. Instead of simply discarding the bodies, he turned them into financial assets. Bunting and his gang kept their victims alive on paper. Their bank accounts remained active, their welfare checks still arrived, and their families, unaware of the horror, still believed they were out there somewhere. Bunting forced victims to sign documents before their deaths, ensuring that he had access to their money long after they were gone. But he didn't stop there. To make the deception airtight, he had their accomplices impersonate the victims. They would withdraw money, forge signatures, even call family members pretending to be the missing person. In some cases, Bunting made them record phone messages before they died, a twisted insurance policy to keep suspicions at bay. Imagine the pain of a mother receiving a voicemail from her missing son, hearing his voice say, "I'm fine, just needed some space." Not knowing that by the time she heard it, her son had already been decomposing in a barrel for weeks. It was the perfect cover up. For years, families held onto hope, believing their loved ones were alive somewhere, struggling but still out there. Meanwhile, Bunting and his gang were living off their victims' money, spending every stolen dollar like it was theirs. But money wasn't the only thing Bunting gained from these twisted games. It gave him something else: power, control. Even after death, his victims were still his puppets, still trapped in the nightmare he created. By the late 1990s, John Bunting and his gang had a growing problem. The bodies were piling up. At first, disposal was easy. Some victims were buried in shallow graves, others were left to rot in backyards. But as the number of murders increased, Bunting needed a better solution, somewhere secure, isolated, and hidden from prying eyes. And then he found it. A small, abandoned bank building in Snowtown, South Australia, a remote town with fewer than 500 residents, where people minded their own business. Even better, the old bank still had its original vault: a thick steel door, soundproof walls, a place meant to keep things safe and locked away. For any normal person, a vault was used to protect valuables. But for Bunting, it became a tomb. No one in Snowtown questioned why a group of men from Adelaide suddenly started renting out an empty bank building. If anything, locals thought it was strange but harmless. They had no idea that just behind those rusting doors, in the darkness of the vault, the remains of multiple victims were slowly dissolving in acid-filled barrels. Snowtown wasn't just a storage space for John Bunting's crimes. It was the final resting place for his victims. And soon, it would be the key to his downfall. Bunting and his gang weren't just killing for pleasure. They were trying to get away with it. And in their minds, acid was the answer. One by one, the victims' lifeless bodies were stuffed into barrels, their limbs forced into the tight space. Then a horrifying chemical bath began: sulfuric acid, meant to break down flesh and bone, leaving nothing behind. But in reality, the plan was a gruesome failure. Instead of completely dissolving the remains, the acid only partially decomposed the flesh, turning some body parts into a sludgy, grotesque mixture, while other sections remained disturbingly intact. Fingers, torsos, even parts of faces were still visible when the barrels were later discovered. The result: a floating, nightmarish soup of human remains trapped inside 6 barrels, stacked in the vault like some twisted collection. And here's where things became even more unbelievable. The killers actually visited the vault regularly. They would sit inside the same room as the barrels, breathing in the rancid air, drinking beer, and joking about the rotting corpses just a few feet away. For them, the vault wasn't a place of horror. It was a trophy room. They had gotten away with murder after murder, and the barrels were proof of their success. But what they didn't know was that their luck was running out, because soon one mistake would blow the whole operation wide open. John Bunting wasn't just killing strangers, he was killing people he knew. People who trusted him, people who considered him a friend, a mentor, even family. And he didn't hesitate. His victims included former housemates, old acquaintances, and even relatives of his own accomplices. It didn't matter how close they were. If he decided they were weak, useless, or inconvenient, they were as good as dead. One of the most disturbing cases: Frederick Brooks. He was just 18 years old, the stepson of one of Bunting's accomplices, Jody Elliott. Bunting had known him for years, watched him grow up, and yet none of that mattered when he decided Frederick had to go. The murder was particularly cruel. The gang forced him to recite false confessions while torturing him, making him say he was a pedophile, a common tactic Bunting used to justify his killings. He suffered unspeakable agony before his body was stuffed into a barrel like the others. But perhaps the most chilling betrayal of all, David Johnson. David was Mark Haydon's own brother in law. Unlike the other victims, he had no idea what he was walking into. One day, he was simply lured to Snowtown under the promise of buying cheap computer parts. He entered the vault completely unaware of what was waiting for him inside. The second he stepped in, the door slammed shut behind him. And standing there was John Bunting. He didn't hesitate. David was tortured, strangled, and ultimately murdered by people who had once called him family. Bunting never showed an ounce of remorse. To him, killing friends was no different than killing strangers, because once you were on his list, your fate was already sealed. For years, John Bunting and his gang kept up an elaborate illusion. Even as the body count rose, no one suspected a thing. Because instead of leaving bodies in the open, they did something far more sinister. They made it look like their victims had never been murdered at all. They played a long, sick game of deception. Whenever someone disappeared, the killers made sure to cover their tracks. They would forge letters and documents to make it seem like the victim had moved away, withdraw money from their bank accounts, keeping their financial activity going, call or text family members pretending to be the missing person. In some cases, they even sent fake messages on behalf of their dead victims, reassuring loved ones that they were fine and just needed time away. One victim's family received a Christmas card from their missing relative, except the relative had been dead for months by that point. To make the ruse even more believable, the killers would casually drop fake stories into conversation. If someone asked about a missing person, Bunting and his gang would lie with confidence. Oh, yeah, he moved up north for work. She's staying with a friend in another city. I think he just wanted a fresh start. And because they controlled the victims' money, rented out their houses, and even drove their cars, the lie held up for years. For a while, it seemed like they had pulled off the perfect cover up. But lies can only last so long. And when police finally started asking the right questions, their entire house of cards came crashing down. For years, John Bunting's reign of terror thrived on absolute control. He didn't just manipulate his victims, he manipulated his own accomplices, turning them into pawns in his twisted game. But there was one problem. Not everyone in his circle could stomach the horror forever. Doubts had been creeping in for a while. One member of the gang, James Vlasakis, was beginning to crack. Vlasakis was younger than the others. At first, he admired Bunting, saw him as a strong, dominant figure, someone who made him feel powerful. But over time, the reality of what he was part of began to suffocate him. He had personally taken part in some of the murders. He had watched Bunting's cruelty up close, the torture, the suffering, the cold lack of remorse. And it was getting worse. The paranoia, the endless cycle of murder. The way Bunting spoke about new victims as if they were already dead. But in Bunting's world, there was no such thing as an exit plan. You were either part of the gang or you became its next target. Vlasakis knew he was trapped, so he played along, pretending to be loyal, hiding his fear. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before everything fell apart. And that moment was coming sooner than he thought. Bunting and his gang had pulled off murder after murder without raising suspicion. They had been careful, methodical. But one slip up changed everything. It started with a simple welfare check. One of the victims, Elizabeth Hayden, had vanished. Her husband, Mark Hayden, was part of Bunting's inner circle. He knew exactly what had happened to her. But to the outside world, she was just another missing person. At first, The killers did what they always did. They faked her presence. They kept her bank account active. They spread false stories saying she had left town. But something felt off to the authorities. A few weeks after Elizabeth's disappearance, someone close to her got suspicious and alerted the police. They weren't accusing anyone of murder yet. They just wanted a routine check, a confirmation that Elizabeth was still alive. That's all it took. When detectives dug deeper, they realized something alarming. Elizabeth wasn't the only missing person connected to Mark Hayden. There were several, and many of them had something strange in common. Their financial activity had continued after they supposedly disappeared. It was too much of a coincidence. Authorities launched a full-scale investigation into multiple missing persons cases tracing back years. And all roads led to one place, Snowtown. The killers didn't know it yet, but the walls were closing in. And soon, police would make a discovery that would shake Australia to its core. Detectives knew something was wrong. At first, it was just a series of missing persons cases, people who had supposedly moved away, lost contact with their families, or simply disappeared. But when they started digging, the pattern became too disturbing to ignore. Many of the missing individuals had connections to John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Haydon. Some were last seen at their homes. Others had financial activity that continued long after they had vanished. The most alarming detail: not a single one of them had been officially reported missing by the people closest to them. Something sinister was going on. Detectives re-examined old police reports going back years. They found a disturbing trail of death and disappearance, all leading to the same tight-knit group of men. And then they got their first major break. James Vlasakis, the youngest member of the group, cracked under pressure. Fearful for his own life, he agreed to talk. What he revealed was worse than anything detectives had imagined. He didn't just confess to murder, he described a ritual of torture, deception, and sadism. He told police about the vault in Snowtown, the place where they stored the bodies, the place where the truth had been rotting in acid for years. Detectives didn't hesitate. They assembled a team, gathered warrants, and prepared for what they suspected would be a grim discovery. But nothing could have prepared them for what was waiting inside that vault. On May 20th, 2001, a team of officers stormed the abandoned bank building in Snowtown. The moment they stepped inside, they knew they had found something terrible. The air was thick with the rancid stench of death. Even through the vault's steel walls, the smell had seeped out, sour, putrid, unmistakable. One by one, officers entered the dark, confined space, their flashlights scanning the cold, concrete walls. And then they saw them. 6 barrels, large industrial blue barrels lined up in a row, sealed tight. The first officer approached, gripping the lid of one. His hands trembled as he twisted it open. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. A human torso floating in thick, bubbling acid. The flesh was partially liquefied, sloughing off the bone, but the features were still distinguishable enough to recognize it as human. Another officer wrenched open a second barrel. Inside, a severed head, still intact, bobbed up to the surface. The vault was a graveyard. As they continued searching, the full horror of Bunting's crimes was laid bare. They found 8 bodies in total, each one dissolved in acid, their limbs contorted, their bones softened. Some had been dead for years. This wasn't just murder. This was systematic, industrialized killing, a twisted operation where victims were used for financial gain, tortured for pleasure, and discarded like waste. The scene was so grotesque, some officers had to step outside to vomit. It was the worst crime scene in Australian history. And at the center of it all, John Bunting, the man who had turned murder into a way of life. The discovery shocked the entire country, but the nightmare wasn't over yet, because now Bunting and his gang would have to answer for their crimes. The moment John Bunting and his gang were arrested, detectives knew they weren't dealing with ordinary criminals. These weren't men who killed in the heat of the moment. They had built an entire system around murder. The first few days of questioning were met with silence and defiance. Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden refused to talk, stone-faced as police laid out the evidence against them. But there was one weak link: James Vlasakis. Unlike the others, Vlasakis had cracked long before the police even showed up. The nightmares, the guilt, the sheer horror of what he had done, it had been eating him alive. So when detectives turned up the pressure, he broke. What he told them was more disturbing than anything they had imagined. He described the kill list. Bunting had kept a sickening tally of those he planned to eliminate. He explained how victims were lured into the house, manipulated, then tortured for days before being killed. He recounted the twisted pleasure Bunting took in the suffering, forcing victims to record false messages before their deaths. For days, detectives sat in disbelief as Vlasakis spilled every gruesome detail. But one thing became clear: this was not just murder. This was a serial killing cult built on fear, manipulation, and absolute control. And John Bunting was at the center of it all. By the time the trial began in 2003, the media had already dubbed it one of the most horrifying murder cases in Australian history. The public was obsessed. People couldn't believe the sheer evil behind the Snowtown murders, the methodical nature of the killings, the way Bunting and his gang had lived normal lives while bodies decomposed in barrels just feet away. And now they would face justice. The trial lasted 12 months, making it one of the longest in Australian history. The prosecution laid out every chilling detail: the torture, the manipulation, the financial fraud, the way Bunting had brainwashed his followers into carrying out his evil. But the most disturbing part: John Bunting never showed a single sign of remorse. He sat in the courtroom, cold, expressionless, as the stories of his unimaginable cruelty were told. Even when confronted with the grisly photographs of his victims, their bodies decayed, their remains mutilated, he felt nothing. No apology, no regret, no fear. Because in his mind, he had done nothing wrong. After months of testimony, the jury finally reached its decision. John Bunting and Robert Wagner were found guilty on 11 counts of murder. Mark Hayden was convicted of assisting in the disposal of bodies, and James Vlasakis, despite his confessions, was sentenced for 4 murders. Bunting and Wagner were sentenced to life in prison, never to be released. Justice had been served, but the damage, it could never be undone. The victims' families, who had spent years hoping their missing loved ones were alive, now had to accept the brutal truth: they had been tortured, killed, and discarded like trash. For many, the pain never faded. Snowtown became a place forever stained by horror, a town that would never escape the shadow of its gruesome past. And those who had once called John Bunting a friend, a neighbor, a family member, they would spend the rest of their lives wondering how they had ever been so blind. Even after the convictions, the Snowtown case left behind chilling, unanswered questions. Could there be more victims? Police believe there may have been more murders, people who disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found. Were there others involved who were never caught? Some believe Bunting's network was even larger than reported, that there were more people who knew, who helped, who stayed silent. And the biggest question of all, how did John Bunting convince so many to follow him into pure darkness? How did a single man manage to brainwash an entire group into becoming willing participants in torture and murder? Was it fear, power, or something even more sinister? The answers may never be fully known, but one thing remains certain: the horrors of Snowtown will never be forgotten.